Liz Truss considers the largest ever cut to VAT to tackle soaring bills as the Conservative leadership contest enters its final week.
A very good morning to you.
And thank God, says everybody. Thank God it's in its final week, and thank God Isabel is back.
I'm finally back. I missed 2 weeks of the leadership contest, and what can I say? It doesn't feel like an awful lot's changed.
Nothing's changed. Nothing has.
Anyway, it's Bank Holiday Monday. We're absolutely delighted to have you with us. It is the 29th of August. You're watching and listening to Breakfast on GB News with Eamonn Holmes and Isabel Webster.
Leading your news this morning, Conservative leadership frontrunner Liz Truss is considering plans to tackle the energy crisis with a 5% cut to VAT. As polling reveals, more than half of Conservative members want energy renationalised.
The outgoing Prime Minister Boris Johnson will reportedly use his final week in office touring the country, with sources suggesting he'll make one final major policy speech before stepping down 7 days from now.
Amber traffic warning in place as millions of drivers hit the roads at the end of the bank holiday. The president of the AA has advised travellers to carry food and water in the event of severe delays.
And remember, we love to hear from you throughout the programme. Get involved in any of our conversations. Email us, gbnews@gbnews.uk, or you can tweet us at gbnews.
You can also subscribe to the GB News channel on YouTube. We've got an app as well. You get all the latest on the big stories. Stay involved. Remember, GB News, the People's News channel.
To our top story this morning, and Conservative leadership frontrunner Liz Truss is reportedly considering a radical slashing of VAT by 5% in order to try and help voters to cope with the worsening cost of living.
So my first reaction to that is, how radical is 5%? We've got Malcolm Grimston now. Malcolm's a senior research fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy on all this, and maybe you can tell us, Malcolm, 5%?
Well, I think that's talking about 5% right the way across the board, not just energy. Energy already has a lower rate of VAT at 5% compared to the 20% across the economy as a whole. I guess the question with all of this is, things are going to be horrendous over the course of the next year. Government can do something about that, but shifting the burden from consumers onto taxpayers still leaves the problem somewhere in the UK.
It's a big problem. Nearly 1 in 4 adults planning not to turn on their heating over the winter. What do you make of that?
I mean, that presumably is if nothing changes and if no help is available. I think we've got to be very, very tight in targeting the help to those who need it most. The group of people I'm most concerned about are those on prepayment meters. Many of us who use direct debit, at the moment, we're building up a bit of money because we're not using all that much energy, and that's something which will be in the bank when it comes to the great increases later in the year. For those who are on prepaid meters, of course, they're paying literally sort of hand to mouth. They're paying as they go along. They're going to be horrendously hit there. So the real focus, my view, rather than trying to bring the overall price of energy down, for me, people like me, I'll take energy more seriously, and somewhere there has to be more money for investment to stop this happening again. But I think it's targeting of those who are going to face the most difficulty rather than a general reduction in
Malcolm, talking about radical, rethinks when we talk about this crisis. Interesting to see that in a YouGov poll commissioned by the Times newspaper this morning, half of current Conservative voters would be in favour of renationalising our energy companies. Now, you wouldn't expect Tories to take a sort of socialist approach on this. Can you just give your reaction to that, and also compare us to other countries, because we're a bit of an outlier compared to many other European countries when it comes to this?
Well, there's a lot of variation. I mean, in France, the electricity industry is basically nationalised. The EDF is technically a company, but 84% of it is owned by the French state. In Germany, it's pretty much all in private hands. In Sweden, it's always been a mixture of private and public ownership.
Is anyone else seeing the same sort of price hikes that the UK is facing?
Yes, they are. I mean, the basic price hike is caused by the international gas price. So the question is really, what are different governments doing about it? In France, because they have a lot of nuclear, which hasn't been affected by this crisis, they've been able to cap the increase on energy prices by 4%. And that's been helped by the fact that it's a public company. But firstly, private nationalisation will be enormously expensive if you do it at the point when the companies are very profitable. profitable, then they're buying them out is going to be very expensive. And of course, once they're in state hands, then they are competing for investment with the sexier things like the health service and the police and education. And experience of the past is that important infrastructure like the rail network, like water, like energy does not get the investment it really needs when in state hands.
You keep saying that. You said to me earlier there, we've got to make sure there is money for investment. What do you mean by that?
Well, one of the reasons why we are where we are is that we didn't invest in nuclear stations 20 years ago, which could have then been coming online to replace the ones that are coming to the end of their life. We didn't invest in some North Sea gas, and we need to move away from fossil fuels. But gas is going to be very important for a long time because it fills the gap when the wind isn't blowing or when the sun isn't out. We didn't invest in the North Sea to the extent that we could have done, which left us very dependent on Europe. And of course, when the European price shot through the roof, we were caught as much as anybody else by that. We do need some investment in our wires. If we're building a lot of offshore wind, we need a lot of new wires to carry that electricity to where it's going to be needed. And all these are big ticket items.
They're not easily solved or quickly anyway. Just on the North Sea issue specifically, we talk a lot about why haven't we done more in recent years to make ourselves energy independent and invest in North Sea energy. But, wouldn't that just be giving more money to BP and to Shell, which they then sell overseas, and we'd still have to then be buying it back? It wouldn't have put us in any more of a secure position.
Well, broadly that's right. But there are two things. So firstly, because it's closer to our market, then delivering that oil and gas into the UK is cheaper because you don't have the transportation cost. And secondly, anything which is bringing new supplies onto the global market will have a downward pressure on prices. Not enormous, because it would be a relatively small player. So it's not entirely the case to think that that degree will be there. But through the licenses which are offered, it might be possible to put a special clause in new licenses for North Sea exploration, which does direct the output towards the UK market.
Okay. Malcolm, answer this for me. This is the thing I don't understand. The energy companies, we all recognize, are making phenomenal, indecent profits out of this. It's not costing them anything. They're just making money on all of this. Why then do we, as a country, then pay for their profits? Why are we, you slash VAT, but it's still coming out of the exchequer, it's still coming out of our taxes. Why are we paying and not them?
Well, first thing is the energy companies we're talking about here are not the suppliers that we buy electricity from directly. They're having a really bad time. Over 30 of those have gone bankrupt.
The suppliers?
It's the upstream. It's the oil and the gas industry. Now, that is an international business. We've already increased the tax on the licenses for the North Sea very considerably, 25%, which does mean that there is more money coming out of those very heavy profits. But if you do get a single country which heavily taxes those, then all that happens is that the companies go elsewhere with their investment. We still end up paying through the nose because we're importing even more oil and gas. And if you're telling those companies you can't make money in the UK market, of course they're not going to invest in the UK market.
But there's only so many places they can go to find oil and gas. They just can't up stumps out of the North Sea and say we're not doing it here anymore, can they?
No, you're talking about long-term investment, but long-term investment is the issue with this. Yeah. There's still enormous potential for oil and gas fracking in the States, for example. Saudi Arabia, still the main, one of the major oil suppliers, has still not really cranked up its output to the extent it might. I think it's playing a waiting game to see what happens. And so there are plenty of places where you're quite right, not overnight, but in the 15, 20-year investment horizon with this, if that money is going to those countries, eventually those are the ones we're going to be dependent on.
Let me ask you this, as a research fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy, up until now, a lot of resistance, a lot of not in my backyard people about fracking, right? Do you think once the price really bites in the winter, that may begin to change people's minds about fracking?
I think it will. If you look at what's happened in the States with their fracking revolution, it has just been extraordinary. They are now energy independent. I don't think the potential in the UK is anything like as great in the States. They have these vast areas of land where nobody lives, where there's no political problems and where it's there. Here we do have some areas, such as the northwest of England, where we could probably frack a reasonable amount of gas. I've yet to be convinced it's actually a game changer, but there's no game changers with a problem of this sort of scale. You've got to look at anything that makes any sort of sense. sense. And I suspect we probably will revisit fracking, but let's not imagine that that's a silver
It's not
bullet.
the one-size-fits-all answer. Okay, Malcolm, thank you. I want to bring in a GB News viewer now. Let's go to Francis Moore. He's joining us this morning from Wilton in Wiltshire. Very good morning to you, Francis. Thank you for joining us bright and early on this bank holiday Monday. Let's start off with fracking. What are your thoughts about that?
Why haven't we done it a long time ago?
Okay.
There seems to be a big battle in government between the net zero team and those that want to put our economy on a sensible footing. And at the moment, I can't see a way through it, because although both candidates have said that they'll allow fracking subject to local approval, we know from the battles in the past where we've had NGOs, we've had Russia, we've had various other stakeholders, including some of the petroleum companies, trying to stop fracking, because obviously that takes away from their own earnings. That's going to be a hell of a fight. Until we actually put fracking on the plate as part of a national emergency response, we're in trouble. We really are in trouble. I agree with Malcolm that, maybe it's not going to make a huge amount of difference, but actually, morale-wise, if we could actually be having our own gas coming out of our own, I think you're showing the Quadrilla site there, I think if we could have our own gas coming out, which is estimated, we could have it if we went by removing the moratorium by January 2023. First gas. And then we could be replicating more sites. The sites themselves don't need a lot of space. There are several football fields. The geological survey information, which interestingly is being withheld by Kwasi Kwarteng, who's rumoured to be Truss's next Chancellor, which is why I think she's enveloped in the net zero team that she's inheriting from Boris. So there's going to be a lot of ugly stuff to come on top of all the very ugly stuff that we've got. Yeah. But we can write, as Malcolm said, we can rewrite contracts with fracking to make it maybe a sort of a cost plus.
Well, Francis, on that, I just want anyone watching at home to come in with their views on this one. GBviews at gbnews.uk, and you can tweet at GBnews. So basically, should we be reconsidering, we're asking you folks, our position or opposition to fracking, and where does this come from? And what's it about? Now, Francis, we just want to tell people about you as a viewer and listener. You're 65 years of age, you're retired, you're on universal credit, and
member of the Conservative Party.
Yeah, but thinking not being a member of the Conservative Party, maybe, yeah?
Well, I'm going to hold in, because unless you hold a vote, you can't really change anything. But I've been very disappointed, actually, in the way that this leadership campaign has gone. It's been very repetitive, and that I don't think that's not a fault of the two leadership contenders. They have to deal with what they're given. But I think the party as a whole needs to have a considerable rethink as to whether all this is going on. But I think that the issue in the background is Boris, who's now coming out trying to firm up his legacy. He's tried to tell us that Ukraine is spilling blood. We're just having to pay the...
We're getting on to Boris Johnson, and I wanted to ask him some political questions. But it links perfectly onto our next guest, which is coming after our
we just want to say goodbye to you, Malcolm, of course, for that. Is there anything that Francis has said that you would like to say to people? I mean, I've asked people for their views on fracking and, should we get real? The coalition government, of course, Cameron with the Liberal Democrats, have a lot to answer for as to why we haven't got energy security and energy independence. So there should be a lot of reflection. How will our energy policy change in the years to come? Because people feel exposed, they feel vulnerable, they're frightened.
Well, I say, first of all, getting carbon emissions down is vital. I think the science around climate change is unanswerable, and as a world, we do need to respond to that. The dreadful picture we're seeing, for example, in Pakistan at the moment with the flooding, that's going to become more typical, and we need to hold that in mind. But what we are seeing today, of course, is that we need three things from energy. It's got to be secure, it's got to be affordable, and it's got to be economic. And when the chips are down, actually, it's the security that's the most important, then the economics. So unless we get those right, we can't do the environmental stuff. And that's why recognizing that gas has a vital role to play as the top-up fuel for, say, when wind and solar are not generating, and recognizing that if we make that gas as close to home as possible, it's environmentally better, we're not wasting energy by transporting it, and it's better for our economy to do so.
Okay.
Then I think that's the context we should be looking at.
Malcolm, really appreciate this. Malcolm Grimston is a Senior Research Fellow at the Centre for Energy Policy. We'll say goodbye to Francis Moore, our GB News viewer. Francis, you were just about to tell us about Boris the Goodbye Tour, which is quite narcissistic, actually, when you think about it. What else were you about to say about that?
Well, what I'm trying to say is that Boris is obviously trying to hang on to his net zero legacy. That's economically crippling this country now. We need to just row back a little bit. No one's trying to sort of deny, I don't deny there's change in the climate, but I just draw us back to all the forecasts, and forecasting climate change is very difficult. And just because we do, I accept what Malcolm's saying, but just because we have had some issues, we've had, the hottest summer since 1976, which I remember very well as a 20-year-old. But the reason I remember 1976 is because there hasn't been another 1976 until now. So I think we do have to take forecasts with a pinch of salt. Although Malcolm was saying that, the science is absolutely certain on climate change, well, I would actually quietly dispute that.
Okay.
It's a forecast.
Okay.
And if we look back even as early as a few years ago with our COVID forecasting, look how we made a mess of that.
Although there is scientific consensus about climate change, but I don't want to get into a big climate change debate with you. Francis Moore, really good to get your thoughts this morning. Thank you for joining us from Salisbury this morning. I want to start discussing some of the political points you were making there with Dan Falvey. He's the Deputy Digital Political Editor at the Daily Express. Good morning. Welcome to the programme. Listen, really interesting, this final week of Boris Johnson with the keys to number 10, and lots of the papers speculating about what he's going to do with these last 5 working days, or 4 working days, I think it is, with the bank holiday. He's on the front of the Telegraph saying, don't give up on green energy. He's obviously making a swipe there at Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss on his proposal to get rid of the green levy. Well, quite. And also these suggestions about Sizewell C, this nuclear power plant, that he might come out and make a big policy announcement, £20 billion, which would cripple whoever takes over as his next, as the successor.
Yeah, I think if you were Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, you might be slightly annoyed at some of the front pages today. The whole summer, Boris Johnson said he's going to make no major interventions because that's for his successor to do. And now, just days left, it appears that he is suddenly planning to make some rather big interventions. And I think both of them would be rather annoyed that they could have their hands tied over the next coming days.
But obviously he's keen to leave a legacy, and he wants that very much to be a green legacy. Interesting, I think, a lot of us were discussing this in the newsroom this morning, that pretty much probably only Boris would be a Conservative PM that could carry through these sorts of green policies. None of the others have the kind of cut through when it comes to sort of pushing through that agenda. Do you think there's any other Conservatives that could do that?
The only interesting thing that there is when Theresa May left office, in her final days, she was the one who put into law the 2050 net zero. In her final days, she felt the need, actually, I need to have a legacy. And she looked and thought, what can I do? And it was about green agenda.
Interesting.
That was then. This is now, of course. There was no war in Ukraine. There was no turning off the gas pipeline. And it really has changed, I think, people's view. I mean, nobody, as Isabel was saying, there's very few people that would deny we're in a climate crisis. But, how do you get through it? I mean, people still are going to face, I think it is scary beyond belief, energy prices. And I'm not just talking about those of us at home, domestic and whatever, if you run a fish and chip shop,
Yes.
if you run a restaurant, if you run
Businesses.
cinema, it's just like, how the heck do you actually keep the doors open? And when all of that begins to bite, I think people will be less green.
I think we're going to see in the first couple of weeks, whoever wins, we think it's going to be Liz Truss, but whether it's Liz Truss or Rishi Sunak, in those first couple of weeks, we're going to see major interventions from government. The country is crying out for it.
But yes, the country's crying out for major interventions, but the last time we did major interventions, we arguably put ourselves into the position that we're trying to deal with now. Handouts, quantitative easing, all inflationary, and all leave the country with a huge national debt, which then has to get passed down the line. And it just seems as though all that sort of war chest that we spent on COVID now needs to be found again to deal with the energy crisis, and we simply cannot do it.
And that's one of